This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Go to brilliant.org/SarahZ and sign up for free. Also, the first 200 people who go to that link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. On September 9th, 2022, Disney released its first official teaser trailer for their brand new remake of The Little Mermaid. As far as teaser trailers go, it's pretty standard fare. Disney logo, a few pretty scenery shots, modern Disneyfied version of the original songs, and then big reveal at the end, our first glimpse of the cast in action. This is a formula they've followed for several of their live-action remakes at this point. Their Aladdin teaser trailer began with pretty scenery shots of Agrabah, the opening notes from Friend Like Me in dramatic orchestral tones, and then at the very end, our big reveal of Aladdin reaching for the lamp. Beauty and the Beast's first teaser trailer treated us to several scenes of the beautiful and empty palace, the opening door, the iconic rose, and at the very end, a blurry Emma Watson reaching for it. As far as formula went, the Little Mermaid teaser trailer was nothing out of the ordinary for Disney, but pretty quickly things diverged from the formula. The Little Mermaid teaser trailer was dislike bombed into oblivion to the point at which it currently sits at nearly 3 million dislikes, compared by the way to 1.1 million likes. It is already in the top 50 most disliked videos on the entire platform, albeit high up on the list. For reference, the Beauty and the Beast teaser trailer has 7,000 dislikes right now, Aladdin has 31,000. The comments right now are mostly flooded with memes about the character quoting other movies, but get past all the jokes about Ursula saying it's Morbin time and you'll get at some interesting sentiments. Wow, this isn't original. Why couldn't they make a new character with a better backstory? I don't like the aesthetics of the ocean. Why doesn't it look as bright and pretty as it did in the original? All in all, outside the memes, the primary tone I can glean from looking at the comments is a general frustration with the parts of it that made it live action. You know, no one needed this, it's not an original idea, it looks much nicer in stylized animation, and of course some obligatory comments making fun of the existence of diversity. This kind of response, though, the complaints about the live-actionness of it, is making up much of the comment section. Just by taking a simple gander into it, you may never guess that the true source of much of this ire is very simple. The movie's Ariel is played by a black woman. By and large, the viewers leaving dislikes don't really mention it, although I would largely attribute this to a heavily moderated comment section. And yet, when you get down to it, this is the only new factor out of a million live-action remake commonalities. It's not an original idea, but neither was bringing us all back to Agrabah or Fantasy France or CGIing expressionless lions. The scenery doesn't look that nice, nor did it in Beauty and the Beast. No one asked for this, nor did anyone ask for another Dumbo. And yet. A couple months ago, I started getting these YouTube recommendations for these 10 or 15 second clips from an animated streaming show, often with disparaging captions about how bad the show was. I watched one, and then like an algorithmic hydra, 10 more would take their place. How not to write natural dialogue, what a terrible villain concept, look how awkward this writing is. And my initial thought was, whoa, yeah, this show looks pretty bad. And then, as my recommendations started to get filled up with more and more videos essentially saying the same thing, I started to get a little more curious. And as I did more Googling and watched more and more, it started to sit worse and worse with me as I began to realize this was yet another example of a phenomenon that's been bothering me for a while. This phenomenon crops up when a mediocre piece of fiction finds itself on the internet's chopping block for reasons that I wouldn't necessarily consider entirely honest. You can call it whatever you want, but I've started calling it sacrificial trash. In this video, I want to lay out what exactly sacrificial trash is, how the phenomenon works, and why I think it can be so harmful. So let's dive in. I didn't have a scripted thing to say after transitioning to the title card, but dive in seems as good as anything. Several years ago, one of the first video essays I ever did was about how diverse media inherently has a higher bar to meet than non-diverse media in the eyes of many progressive critics. I talked about how queer authors and authors of color are immediately subject to more scrutiny than their straight and white counterparts, how there's this pressure that characters who aren't straight white guys not be flawed lest they be considered poor representation of the groups to which they belong, how that puts an increased pressure on marginalized creators and restricts what they can safely create without a fear of backlash. And I stand by all of that now. But there's a larger phenomenon at play here, and it's something I want to dig into in this video. It's a phenomenon I first noticed when the trailer for the 2016 remake of Ghostbusters came out. This was a couple years out from the height of Gamergate, but in many ways it felt like an extension of it. And I actually caught some shit for this when I brought this up in the geek culture video, but what I said then is that the backlash originated for essentially no reason other than the all-female cast. And indeed, the backlash was immediate and intense. All of the actors, but especially Leslie Jones, were subject to a campaign of unrelenting hate. As I said, I went more into detail about that in that video, but the long and short of it was that the film was review bombed, the actors harassed in really horrible misogynistic and in some cases racist ways, and the consensus very quickly became that the movie is terrible. At best, it was a cynical attempt to capitalize off of 80s nostalgia with a woke bent to it, and at worst, it was a concerted effort to destroy the only vestiges of male childhood that we have left. Despite a mostly positive critical consensus, the film is now broadly considered to be cynical and bad. Now, is the film especially good? Personally, I don't think it is. The movie tends to lean in too hard on over-explaining its own jokes, the characters are charming enough but not especially multidimensional, and the plot is serviceable at best. It's certainly not that bad, it's not even the worst movie in the Ghostbusters franchise, but I wouldn't call it especially good either. But the ire the film and everyone involved in its making got was still disproportionate, right? 2016 saw a number of mediocre films, and Ghostbusters wasn't anything close to the worst that year had to offer. It's very easy to look at a phenomenon like that and say, well, it's simple. The brigading of Ghostbusters was a harassment campaign committed exclusively by a bunch of far-right internet trolls attacking a good movie for its diversity. The people doing it were all bigots consciously attacking women and especially a woman of color. Same for the Little Mermaid dislike bombing, same for everything else. But while I think bigotry was very obviously the motivating factor in all of this, generally speaking, I also think that that is only part of the broader explanation for this continuing phenomenon. Many of the comments I got when I talked about Ghostbusters came from people who, at minimum, did not consider themselves to be bigots. They were saying things like, wait a minute, I also didn't like Ghostbusters and talked about not liking it, but it had nothing to do with them being women or the harassment the actors received. Of course I don't endorse that, I just thought it was a bad movie. And while it'd be easy to write off every person who argued that as some kind of bad faith concern troll, I don't think this was universally true. If someone leaves a comment on your channel, you can search for more comments on the same channel from them, which is how I know that some of these comments were from longtime viewers who broadly held progressive values. I think many of them were sincere in this belief. What they were missing, though, is that at the end of the day, whether Ghostbusters or any other piece of media that ends up in this cycle of public backlash was good or bad or just okay isn't entirely relevant. The point is that the film ended up being essentially a sacrificial lamb, used as a symbol representing diversity on the whole. And while those fears are mainly held by the worst of the harassment-committing bigots we talked about earlier, those average Joes who just didn't like a not very good movie are, in fact, a crucial part of this whole equation. They are where the battle is. This is the phenomenon of sacrificial trash. In effect, sacrificial trash refers to a piece of media that, 1, prominently features creators or characters of a marginalized identity, be it from gender, race, disability, sexuality, or a combination thereof. 2, is not especially good, and 3, faces a large, wide-scale public backlash in which it is largely considered to be terrible trash. And what essentially happens here is that hatred for this one given piece of media becomes a convenient proxy to direct a backlash against general concepts like diversity or women creating things. Oftentimes, the creators behind these projects are subject to a heavy amount of horrible abuse, some of which is incredibly overt in its bigotry, and some of which has the veneer of plausible deniability. I'm not sending Halle Bailey death threats on Instagram because she's a woman of color. I just don't like her singing and think she's in a bad movie. But more broadly than that, you'll see things like review bombing, massive amounts of social media outrage, and oftentimes a cottage industry of YouTube and nowadays also TikTok accounts churning out content against this media. I think, though, that a crucial trait of Sacrificial Trash is that these backlashes are often picked up outside the insular circles of the most dedicated bigots that exist online. Indeed, the biggest vector for the spread of these backlash campaigns and what ultimately pushes them into becoming self-sustaining are not people with usernames like FemoidHater2003, it's your average well-meaning viewers who just don't like a thing and want to be entertained. I could use a pretty wide variety of films and TV shows here to highlight my point. I've already talked about live-action Disney remakes, Ghostbusters, we could talk about things like the new Doctor Who seasons, or the new She-Hulk show, or the Charlie's Angels remake, but one example that I really want to use as a case study is that cartoon I mentioned earlier, High Guardian Spice. I watched the whole thing over a couple days with Emily and found its role in broader pop culture incredibly interesting. Because while it's indeed not very good, the way online discourse about the show has been shaped is incredibly telling. For those not in the know, High Guardian Spice is a 12-episode animated series meant to be anime mega giant Crunchyroll's first foray into original programming. Well, it would have been had it actually come out on time. High Guardian Spice met so much controversy from the moment that it was announced that there's compelling evidence that Crunchyroll held back on releasing the series because of the intense amount of backlash it received. And intense is the proper way to describe it. Simply typing in the series name on YouTube will show you hundreds of videos with millions of views all talking about how bad the series is, some of them from the same channels who seem to do nothing but criticize the show to the point where their collective content against the series is longer than the series itself. You'll see compilations of the show's worst moments focused on various different topics and subject matter. Essentially, people online really hate this show. A show must be extremely bad to get this much coverage and receive this much vitriol. And this is precisely why works that get trapped in the greater culture war can be frustrating. Because here's the thing. High Guardian Spice is a bad show, it's just not a bad show for the reasons why people are mad at it. The central premise of this series is about 4 kids who go to a magic school, which as far as premises go isn't the worst, like someone could probably do something interesting with that. Hey, listen to Trials and Trebuchets, it's the D&D podcast I do with my friends, we're also 4 kids at a magical school, what's up? Theoretically, there's more to the premise than that. The mom of lead character Rosemary was apparently some great warrior who went missing years ago. There's some sort of big bad plan going on that's very unclear. For the most part, though, the majority of the 12 episodes are spent just doing magical school stuff. That's sort of the crux of the problem. For the most part, High Guardian Spice is a subpar, trope-filled slice-of-life cartoon, spending way too much time on episodes that were probably meant to be fun character development romps, but instead come off as filler before trying hard to cram some form of plot into the final few episodes. The world building bounces between generic and non-existent, it's a very low-budget affair, and it shows with some kinda awkward animation and voice acting that ranges from acceptable to incredibly unprofessional.
The Rune of Destruction can have many meanings, including...
Mr. Caraway?
It's Professor, yes?
What's a... rune?
The characters are flat, either being basic archetypes or only getting enough screen time to be defined by singular emotions, like, oh, here's the quick one, the sad one, the fun one, the mean one. In the entirety of the show, the only character I had any affection for was Slime Boy, and that's only because he's just a delightful little weird dude with a performance that makes you unsure if his actor is a genius or if he just has a really bad microphone.
I got caught with ink legs in my dorm once. You know inkles? They're, slimy. Anyway, sorry, I just came in here to cry, but I...
Each episode starts with a content warning about explicit violence and language, but besides some various uses of the word shit and some early Naruto levels of blood toward the end of the series, there's not much to distinguish it from a kids' TV show, forced moral at the end of every episode and everything, which makes the content warning more and more ill-fitting and funny as the show goes on. Content warning! Are you ready to get fucked up? This show is gonna be so edgy, it's gonna blow your tits right off! Because of the number of characters, episodes tend to not just have A and B plots, but C and D plots as well, making them confusing to watch, plots hard to decipher, and nothing getting the proper attention it should. It's a very not good show. But the problem is that I can't just simply say that High Guardian Spice is a bad show, because even just acknowledging online that I don't like it is playing into the very overblown backlash that is stuck with the series. While some people online dislike High Guardian Spice for this reason, the fact is that people were against the show before any of these aspects were even known, before people had even seen the show, when all they had to go off of was a 2-minute trailer and some work-in-progress storyboards. It all comes back to that original announcement video that dropped in 2019. The video showcased several creative talents working on the show, giving only a simple summary before moving on to talking about the diversity behind the scenes on the show. How the series was developed by a trans man, how it's written by an entirely female writer's room, how the crew is 50% female.
Our characters are really diverse, our cast is really diverse, and that's one of the things that excited me the most about it.
We are 50% female in all the creative roles, and our writer's room is 100% female. I mean, this is what my whole career has been about, is trying to get those voices in there that are not being heard.
I have to be honest when I say that this is a bad trailer, or at least a bad announcement trailer. The fact that it is so nothing with very little to show for itself besides just talking about the behind-the-scenes stuff doesn't really generate a lot of interest. I think it's something even the staff who worked on the show would agree on and didn't necessarily want their show marketed this way. The trailer isn't great. But of course, the trailer wasn't allowed to be just not great. People on the internet lost their fucking minds. The emphasis on diversity in the trailer was like a siren to the chuds of the internet. Doubly so because this was an original Western-developed animated series released on an anime-centric streaming platform, and one with a CalArts-esque style too. Back when this was still a thing people cared. Do people still care about the whole like CalArts thing? I don't know. I haven't heard that in a while, but I might just be hanging out in the right circles. Anyway, this was happening right when there was a pushback towards that style of animation because of Thundercats Roar, which experienced a similar backlash, though not one as long-lasting as High Guardian Spice's. Outraged people online began latching on to any part of the production they could to raise a fit, making dozens upon dozens of videos, harassing the writers, dragging out old tweets and messages to show that random people working on it hated men, and using it to signal the fall of anime and animation as a whole. When Crunchyroll quietly dropped all 12 episodes online 2 years after that initial trailer, the backlash got even worse. By this point, High Guardian Spice had already obtained the reputation online of being a show that looked bad and generic and was all about diversity, and that it was bad because it was all about diversity. And when the show finally came out, that preconceived bias was then used by people online to fuel rage towards the very existence of the series. Of course, a show that just happens to feature diversity and experiences backlash is not in and of itself sacrificial trash. You know, it doesn't make the backlash inherently like transphobic or anything of that nature. And I think the vast majority of people clicking on these little clips probably don't hold any intentional negative sentiments in that regard. They just want to look at their recommendations and laugh about some bad voice acting. It takes a second of searching to find the real root of all of this. When you look at a site like IMDb and go through the reviews for this show, a couple phrases start popping up on the regular. Politics, political, forced politicking, which is interesting because this is a decidedly not very political show. Fucking Owl House is legitimately more political than this. And then you go on their Facebook page and look at the comments and you start seeing triggered memes and comments like woke garbage. And then you look at how a large number of these videos are all from the same channel, a guy called Guardian HQ who has put out 175 of these things and is still at it even now. And then you join their Discord server and see a million posts about how the show hates men and is anti-male propaganda and is biased against anyone who isn't trans, and you're like, alright, this isn't just about the animation and writing, is it? At least not on the parts of the largest producers of anti-High Guardian Spice content, from whom most of this cultural backlash is directly originating. Going through these videos and comments is wild because so many of them are, again, talking about how the show has such forced diversity, how it's filled with characters defined by nothing but their race, how it hates men and portrays all of them as assholes or incompetent, or how it cares more about pushing an LGBTQ agenda than it does telling a good story. All of these critiques are interesting because none of them are actually true. Let's address this bit by bit. The characters in High Guardian Spice do vary a lot in race, yes, both in the D&D race sense and also just in the sense that there's a variety of skin colors out there. But to say that these characters are defined by their race is blatantly wrong. At no point is race a factor in the story at all, skin color never comes up, and no big deal is ever made about certain characters being different races. Indeed, despite a pretty diverse cast of background characters, most of the leads are white, and the characters that are not have never had that fact pointed out or made into a story element. In fact, it's strange because so often in online discourse, you hear people say how they don't have a problem with people of color being in media, they just want them to exist in the world rather than be forced into it or for it to be a focal point. And yet, when High Guardian Spice does exactly that, they still say that the existence of non-white characters is forced diversity. So it becomes very clear very quickly that what these people actually mean is that they don't want non-white characters in their stories. Now let's move on to the supposed misandry and negative portrayal of male characters. The main example for this that you see online in essays and montages are two characters, Aster and Cal. Aster is a character who appears in only a single episode of the series, being introduced as a cool crush for Rosemary before he gradually reveals himself to be more and more of a mean himbo, a sort of Gaston type, if you will.
I have a lot to learn about myself and how girls look cute when they climb walls and stuff.
People get really mad because the episode ends with a hammer being dropped on his foot and everyone laughing, which is apparently promoting violence against men, which, okay, sure, Wile E. Coyote dropping an anvil on himself is also promoting discrimination against coyotes. Next is Cal, who is actually voiced by ProZD, which is just kind of interesting. Cal is a classmate who appears a few times and is transphobic to one of the characters, Snapdragon, who spends the series going through gender exploration.
Dude, why are you dressed like a girl? This is messed up.
So by this logic, the show is anti-man because it has an asshole character appear in one episode and has a recurring bully character who isn't even the main bully character in the series. The main bully character of the series is in fact a woman, and while she has some softening moments, she is very clearly meant to be unlikable and someone to be rooted against.
Hey! Oops.
Of course, this take also ignores the various positive portrayals of men in the series, from the young Parnell to the all-time great slime boy to the kind blacksmith teacher or the martial arts teacher. The series actually manages to portray both its female and male characters well, and while the cast might skew a bit toward the female side, that's really not uncommon in the sort of magical girl series High Guardian Spice is clearly taking inspiration from. The only reason why someone would think this series is anti-men is either because they don't want to see any male characters portrayed negatively ever, or more realistically, they came in with the preconception that the show was going to be anti-men and latched onto any crumb that gave even the littlest hint of misandry solely to drive up outrage online. Now for the apparent LGBTQ content that this show apparently shoved down all these people's throats. When it comes to gay stuff, it's basically nothing. Like, the gay stuff is there's a lesbian couple that houses the leads in 1 or 2 episodes, at least one of the leads is confirmed to like girls, and that's basically it. The gay stuff is just that a couple gay people exist. Once again, like the race thing, it's actually doing that thing of just letting characters be gay without making a big deal about it, and when people complain about its presence in the show, it really just reveals that they don't want gay people in their media at all. There is also the trans aspect of the show, which is a bit more complicated and definitely the one social justice leftist thing the show actually does try to send a message on. There are 2 canonical trans characters in the show: Professor Caraway, a trans man portrayed by the show's creator, and the aforementioned Snapdragon, whose main story arc in the first season is coming to terms with her gender and leading up to potentially finally coming out as a girl and transitioning to a woman. Of the 2, Caraway is definitely the weaker character. His voice acting isn't great, which in turn makes his scenes come off as generally kinda awkward.
Lavender and I met when we were students here together, our first year.
His big trans scene is one where he's talking to Rosemary about being friends with her mom and showing Rosemary old pictures he had with her from before he transitioned, and then explaining to Rosemary, who had never heard of the term transgender before, what that means and how he has to use magic every month to keep this form.
You are a girl?
I'm transgender.
I don't know that word.
I was born into a female body, but it wasn't the right body for me. So I used new magic to change it.
It's an awkward awkwardly written moment, if I'm allowed to be honest, as it does feel like a pause in an unrelated conversation to explain gender identity, followed by Rosemary jumping straight back into talking to her mom without really reacting to the information Caraway just gave her about himself. It's a scene that has good intentions, but definitely needed to be reworked a lot more. Snapdragon has more blatantly trans content, and quite honestly, it's pretty good. It helps that it's the one character arc that the show seems to actually care about developing as time goes on, and there's a genuine sense of progression. From Snapdragon expressing discomfort at getting lumped in with boys, to using Halloween as an excuse to experiment with gender presentation, to getting frustrated at her own body and how it's not what she wants to be and how she wishes she could socialize with girls, and finally to learning that she actually could transition if she wanted to and be happy in a fairly much better Caraway scene where a trans elder gets the chance to help an egg see it would be okay to come out.
I want smooth skin and smaller hands, and I don't know, it's like the girls, they look so strong and beautiful as mermaids. I want to be a warrior like that.
Snapdragon, listen.
You say I can change paths, but it's not like I can just stop being a guy.
As someone who has a co-writer that's a trans woman, who is also writing all of this, if it isn't obvious, I don't know if I should put on the beanie or not, Snapdragon's journey felt very similar to what it actually felt like, managing to touch on a lot of the fear and anger and sadness and eventual joy that comes through going through the gender discovery process. Quite honestly, despite the show being bad and more than likely never getting any form of follow-up content, there is a part of me being Emily, who is sort of disappointed that Snapdragon's story won't get followed up on, as it's one of the better trans narratives I've ever seen explored in an animated medium. So yeah, when it comes to trans stuff, we have an awkward character and the only arc in the show that's actually compelling, so balances out to not really being worth getting mad at unless you just hate trans people, which yeah, many of these people do. And the weird thing is that despite how not good the show is, it's not even that remarkably not good. Like, the animation is bad and the story is generic, but like, the animation isn't that bad. Like, it's closer to early Dragon Ball Super than it is to Berserk 2016, and the story still has the same issue with tropes and filler that something like Ruby had in its first season. Frankly, I think that if High Guardian Spice had been made by a Japanese studio with basically the exact same script with the same level of animation flaws, it probably would have been liked by many of the people online who claim to hate it. And the people thinking this is one of the worst shows ever and that it's killing animation probably wouldn't even notice if it came out on something like Disney XD or Netflix or whatever, where it probably should have always been. At the end of the day, High Guardian Spice is a mediocre series that got a reputation for being some terrible, awful sin to animation solely because it came out of the gate showcasing its diverse talent and people decided to pounce in response. And one of the problems once people start pouncing is that even the animals walking alongside the stampede inadvertently become part of the herd. By acknowledging that the show is flawed, by admitting that I find it bad, am I not just contributing to the same hostile campaign that the staff has had to deal with the whole time? What do you do when you can't engage in content without also becoming part of the culture war that content has become immersed in? I mean, this even extends to passive viewing of this content as well. Part of the thing about campaigns like this is that even if it may be obvious that a work is getting brigaded by intolerant internet people, it's easy to get swept up in it just by engaging in online criticism. It's easy to passively click on a video titled something like "The Failure of Channel Awesome's Demo Reel" because there's a sense of fun in seeing someone rip apart something or talk about something bad. A fair bit of you first came to this channel because you wanted to see me talk shit about something like Insatiable or Supernatural. Oftentimes, the overt bigotry of these campaigns isn't necessarily well hidden, but may take a few moments to reveal itself, so the average viewer could watch a bunch of High Guardian Spice takedown videos just out of morbid curiosity about this show they've heard is a disaster and not really realize what's going on. And by the time they do, the damage is already done and the creator of the video has increased their metrics and analytics, which then increases both their profits and their potential reach. In other words, most of the people bolstering this backlash are just normies or casuals or whatever you want to call them, but it is engineered by bigots to, 1, direct the negative attention of public opinion toward marginalized creators, and 2, create larger backlashes against the concept of diversity. This not only serves a broader point in the discourse, but has an intimidating effect against other creators who might be afraid to showcase their work in the future. What I think is especially important to note here is the fact that the people orchestrating these larger, unfounded backlashes against, say, woman-dominated shows for being woman-dominated do not really care about the quality of these works, right? The people falsely claiming High Guardian Spice is cis-phobic or something had always planned to deride it for that, regardless of the show's quality, because the ringleaders behind these backlashes generally do not like women and generally do not like queer people. This Is a Bad Movie is not the root cause behind these backlashes. Rather, they are a convenient excuse. If these people could, they would do this to everything that is diverse, because they don't believe women and queer people and people of color should be able to create without fear. It's just that the bad stuff, or even the mediocre stuff, is where this kind of backlash works, because that is where regular people who just want to watch a fun YouTube video about a bad show can then be weaponized to participate in it. And we know this is true because we've watched these people attempt similar campaigns against diverse media that is good. It just doesn't stick as often. Take Netflix's She-Ra, for example. The moment that was announced, there was a massive amount of posts and videos that initially seemed like people just complaining about the character designs, but it quickly became clear that it was just about people hating that there were more different body types and a more diverse cast. During the show's initial announcement, there was a lot of review bombing and accusations of woke SJW garbage. The initial teaser trailer has a massive amount of dislikes to likes, and while comments are now turned off, I remember a lot of this stuff being really awful. Some of those tweets are still publicly available and really give the whole game away. Now, comparatively, the She-Ra Season 5 trailer was released to massive acclaim because it turns out it was a really good show, and so the kinds of people who just hated it for being gay were not able to further weaponize this backlash. Most normal people who like cartoons and watched it generally thought, yeah, that was pretty good, or at least that it was okay. But the initial trailer response is a very good way of demonstrating that if they could have done this to She-Ra, they would have. The quality doesn't actually matter. The ringleaders just didn't like the diversity. It's not just She-Ra either. Time and time again, you see these initial attempts to start a "I don't hate the diversity, I just think this thing is bad" frenzy that peter out because the works are honestly just good. You have Watchmen 2019, which got some outrage from people mad about it not being true to the source material, though as you dig deeper, it became more clear that it was really just people complaining about the show's focus on race and its inclusion of a black lead. There's something like The Last of Us 2, where people originally complained about the game's pacing and story choices, though it became clear that its most vocal critics on social media were more frustrated by it focusing on a gay woman who wasn't attractive by anime waifu standards, while also mad that it dared to question the morality of the original game's male lead. The common through line in all of these is that yes, these initial concerns may be valid. You may not like the story of The Last of Us 2, or you might not be interested in Watchmen 2019 because of how different it is from the comics, etc., etc. But at the heart of it, often you find that the main ringleaders organizing these backlashes are engaging in a backlash towards diversity and any story focusing on or appealing to anyone who isn't a straight cis white guy. But more broadly than that, you can still find examples of backlash against these works, right? Like, there are still people on Twitter who will complain to you about She-Ra if you tweet about the show, and The Last of Us 2 subreddit is still a transphobic shithole that needs to be shut down. But for the most part, as I said, it doesn't really catch on, at least not past the initial boom of the diversity itself being revealed. Essentially, people try to organize these backlashes against anything with any sign of diversity, and using these better pieces of media that later end up receiving a lot of acclaim as a case study really shows how this is the case. You could use this fact to claim that this is still in some way a meritocracy, but like, that isn't good enough, right? Queer creators shouldn't have to be exemplary every single time to avoid this kind of awful response that they will inevitably receive, just lasting forever. Being mediocre should not be a death sentence that subjects these creators to eternal harassment campaigns that are totally super 100% only about the mediocrity of their works. If you are shown over and over again that you have to create near perfect art not to have the hellfire of the internet rain down on you forever, you might just not create at all. Maybe if you make a She-Ra or a Watchmen, it'll only happen for a while until the critics move on to whatever new targets will generate them clout and profit. But that should not be a satisfactory status quo. Like, for the most part, straight white dudes are allowed to make mediocre art and just have it be mediocre art. When someone like Leslie Jones or Elizabeth Banks does it, however, it trends on Twitter for weeks and some fucking YouTuber named The Last Real Jedi making $80,000 a year by never shutting up about it. People who want to create and are taught over and over again that they have to be perfect or they will be raked over the coals, partly by their own communities, which I made a video about years ago, and mainly by average people who have been weaponized in service of bigotry, recognize what they are being shown. Sacrificial trash is, above all else, a threat. On this topic of clout and profit, one of the things I want to explicitly address about the preponderance of sacrificial trash is that a lot of the time, even beyond people who explicitly consider themselves bigots and normal, well-meaning people who just want to watch or participate in a takedown solely for entertainment value, is that a lot of the time, sacrificial trash ends up on the altar for the sole reason that there exists a very real profit motive to engage with it. I talked a little bit about this in my West Elm Caleb video, where I talked about online harassment campaigns and mechanized how corporations benefit from it. Things that provoke outrage, controversial titles, salacious subject matter, get clicks, which means people watching outrage-provoking content will stay on the platform longer and thus make the platform more money. So platforms have a very direct incentive to show you stuff that will make you angry. But I also want to note the fact that this incentive exists on the creator side too. If I titled this video something like, "Ghostbusters is terrible and I hate women and here's why," more people would have clicked on it. It's admittedly a trick that I've used in the past, albeit only because I want to get people to watch something I consider thoughtful. You know, if you make a video about why online discourse can easily get poisoned and critiquing online puritanism, more people will watch it if you call it fandom's biggest controversy than they will if you call it like online discourse can easily get poisoned and the rise in puritanical thinking is concerning, right? Like, it works. But this kind of system also incentivizes the most click-minded people to generate outrage-baiting content for very little effort, and you don't even have to really care about the subject you're covering to get a lot of benefit out of it. When the frankly horrific public vivisection of Amber Heard was at its peak, you had news sources interviewing some of the biggest channels behind the phenomenon. One of them was a homeschooled 15-year-old boy who literally flat out said to the interviewers, "Yeah, I'm not really following any of this very closely, but I put one video up and it got a lot of clicks and I made a lot of money from it, so I just kept doing it." Some big law YouTubers who covered the case and followed along made 6 figures just in the course of that month from drama-hungry audience members. And of course, so did brands. Fuck you, Milani, fuck you, Duolingo, but that's a gripe for another time. And don't get me wrong, not caring about the consequences you impart on minorities is absolutely a form of bigotry. Incidentally, Innuendo Studios just put out a great video on that topic, check it out if you have the chance, but not in the way that we typically think of bigots deliberately generating backlash against the marginalized. Outrage gets attention, and so once a group of bad actors has been able to sufficiently stir up a public backlash against some sort of mediocre movie and direct public opinion toward the destruction of a creator who dared create while being a woman or a person of color or trans, all they really have to do is sit back and watch people grasp onto whatever is the most profitable. I don't have an immediate solution for this. It's not as if I have the power to appeal to platforms here, but I do think that the financial incentive to participate in these kinds of dog piles is relevant and shouldn't go unstated. Of course, the biggest consequence of all of this, without any doubt, is the harm this unleashes upon marginalized individuals trying to create. The creator of High Guardian Spice experienced a massive and uncomfortable amount of transphobic backlash because of this movement, as did one of its writers, who was also repeatedly incorrectly identified as the creator. And of course, I already mentioned how this has a silencing effect on marginalized people in general, who might want to create, but see the kinds of horrors that can be unleashed on people who commit the sin of making mediocre art while being a woman, or not white, or LGBT. But I think another impact this phenomenon phenomenon has is that it makes genuine discussion about the artistic merits of any given work near impossible. In a perfect world, I could make a full-scale review of something like High Guardian Spice or Ghostbusters or whatever the mediocre work du jour is, and it would be a completely neutral act. You know, I'm at least in part a critic, and I genuinely love to criticize, not from the perspective of trying to tear something down, I'm not 19 anymore, but from the perspective of taking it apart and figuring out what made it not work and how it could be fixed. I watched all of High Guardian Spice, and I had a lot of fun doing an imaginary workshop of it in my head, but I don't think I could ever release something like that, at least not on a public platform any bigger than like maybe Patreon or something, because it would nonetheless contribute to a larger social phenomenon it's impossible to opt in or out of. We should be able to just review works of fiction based on their own merits. We should get to have open conversations about things. Whenever sacrificial trash backlashes happen, you get people responding to them by furiously defending the works in question, really overcompensating by talking about how something like Ghostbusters or High Guardian Spice is the best thing in the world and they love it so much and the backlash is completely made up whole cloth, and it always feels a little bit patronizing. Obviously, that's not to say no one genuinely could believe something like that. Art is very personal, but the type of response I often see very much reads like overcompensation in a way that I don't love, both as a creator and as a critic. Just as it's harmful to even inadvertently participate in dog piles against marginalized creators for the sole fact of creating mediocre work while marginalized, it is just as harmful and condescending to refuse to engage with that work on any critical terms. This is especially damaging when it comes to the ability for folks to make genuine critique of tokenism and exploitation from a progressive standpoint. One point I've seen made quite a bit is that the way High Guardian Spice introduces its first trans character feels tokenizing to some trans people. Or I've seen conversations led by and from people of color about how Disney often ends up reducing complex cultures down to easily consumable and sanitized theme parkifications and how much that sucks. One of the things I think is really important to talk about with the new She-Hulk is the show's over-reliance on CGI. This matters not just from the standpoint of, the special effects are bad, well, I don't like it, but rather because these are often the consequences of, one, not hiring practical effects artists who are more likely to be unionized and demand higher standards of treatment, and two, not treating the people you do hire, your VFX artists, well. Like, there's a real point behind the CGI sucks, and I would love to be reliably confident that all of the people making that point are talking about real quality and labor issues and not whining because the Hulk is a woman. Those critiques need to be made for a variety of reasons, and we likewise can't assume anyone making them is acting in bad faith explicitly to bolster bigots. But where does that leave us exactly? When we have these works that are not very good, but are nonetheless swept up into culture wars and turned into objects of public mockery, engaging with the overblown hate machines is not a neutral act. The millions of views on videos tearing apart works that just so happen to prominently feature trans people end up having a real effect on those creators. Even the act of watching them makes money and improves the analytics of the driving forces behind these backlashes, who are often bigots, and galvanizes and enables them to keep doing it. But at the same time, often these works do have genuine problems, and we certainly shouldn't respond to this phenomenon by designating sacrificial trash as exempt from any criticism. Just as these mass targetings have a silencing effect on the marginalized, so too would simply setting a norm that we must have nothing to say about, what the potential impacts of the Disney Corporation here might be. Indeed, that is very important. So, what do we do about all of this? I will say that I don't have a sole and perfect answer here, nor can we very clearly delineate which criticisms might be contributing to right-wing backlashes and which ones could never ever be interpreted that way or boost the algorithmic engagement potential of outrage farming content. And once again, I really do want to restate that watching a few videos making fun of some bad anime does not mean you are forever an awful person or anything like that. It is impossible to exist in our broader world and not do harm. Oftentimes times I think there's this tendency to categorize everyone in the world as harm doers and good doers, which also leads to actually making harm more difficult to combat. When we see harm doers as a category of person entirely separate from ourselves, it makes dehumanization and harassment much easier. And it also means we never want to consider ourselves harm doers, so we might respond with immediate defensiveness when we're asked to consider whether we've contributed to harm. I know I have. I think in general, as a broad rule, the best thing we can do is try to minimize harm wherever we can. So while it's not the end of the world to have accidentally participated in a backlash without doing all the digging and recognizing that the source of it was some right-wing channel that has been harassing creators for being trans for years and just happened to strike gold by finding an actually bad show, we can still do our best now to be more careful and discerning about how we engage in media criticism. And so while that doesn't mean we can never express our honest opinion about media we think is bad, I do think it means we should be more careful when it comes to considering how and why we do that. I do think just identifying the problem also isn't a terrible start. Oftentimes, when a sacrificial trash backlash happens, we start to have the same conversations over and over again on loop. Something will get a lot of hate, ostensibly for just being not very good. Someone will point out, hey, isn't it kind of suspect that this thing just so happens to have a lot of trans people in it? Someone else will respond, no, it's just not very good. I can't believe you're calling me a bigot for just recognizing that this isn't very good. And the conversation will continue ad nauseum. I think it's a beneficial ability for people to be able to identify the fact that the actors engineering this backlash are choosing mediocre works very strategically for the sole fact that they can weaponize the average viewer. And no, we don't have to pretend fucking Ghostbusters is peak cinema in order to do this, but we also don't need to have 50 million videos all saying the same thing that just so happen to draw in a bunch of outrage-hungry chuds who want nothing more than to publicly destroy a woman online. Basically, while I think everyone should have the ability to criticize as they wish, recognizing where a given criticism might come from and who might benefit from it is equally important. Obviously, individual solutions are never going to completely resolve these problems, but I think things like considering the source of a given backlash, being very, very careful about what criticisms are offered and what work these critics are doing to make sure they're not contributing to harm, and just having more open and honest conversations about the impact these things have on marginalized creators are all important steps. All we can really do in this world is do our best to be a little more thoughtful and intentional every day. And also to Stan Slimeboy, he's great. One of the things I always try to make sure hits home in my videos is the importance of critical thinking, and I think resources that encourage that are really cool. That's why I'm really pleased to have partnered with Brilliant for this video. Brilliant is this really cool, hands-on, interactive problem-solving website. It's full of various interactive puzzles that you can use to learn about topics like computer science, probability, math, and more. Specifically though, I really want to highlight Brilliant's course on scientific thinking, both because it's honestly really cool and fun, and also because I really think anyone could benefit from it. It goes into a wide variety of topics, from how to think about our everyday world as a series of puzzles to making things like physics and our natural world really easy to understand while making it fun. I also want to highlight its programming classes because programming is something I've been trying to get into for a while, and I think Brilliant is one of the coolest resources in how to do that. There's a whole class just on using Python, and it starts with just how to make a little drawing. And as a person who's always considered myself more creatively minded, I found it a really cool and helpful and accessible way of doing things. Whether you're a total beginner like me who just loves to learn and wants some useful ways of looking at the world, or someone who wants to dig into more advanced stuff, Brilliant has pretty much all of it. To check it out and learn more, just go to brilliant.org/SarahZ and sign up for free. And as a special bonus, the first 200 people who use that link are going to get 20% off the annual premium subscription. On top of a big thank you to all my patrons, I'd like to specially thank Eve Pritchard, RJ, James Dugan, Queen Autumn Ween, Sophie McLaughlin, 124MM10, Benson Lai, Clayton and Claire Page, Roman Antonacci, Evan Grip, Zach Radley, Simon Welsh, Robert Valentine Allen, Lachlan Newport, Yehuda Katz, Vostok, and Jacob Furtado for joining my $20 plus tier. I also have a patron who'd like me to shout out a charity instead of their name, so today I'm shouting out P Flag Canada. They're an organization primarily centered around LGBTQ resources across Canada, with chapters all over the country, both on large levels and on smaller levels, like advocating for local school boards to provide support for LGBT students. They're a really great resource, and I would highly endorse supporting them. I also wanted to say for non-patrons that I've added a bunch of new things to my Patreon page, so now every month, patrons get to vote on and watch an exclusive unscripted video. Already, we've done things like watch the Netflix vampire show First Kill, play Broadway Jeopardy, and more. If you're interested, feel free to give me some support on Patreon. It helps out a lot.